Good morning. It's great to see so many familiar faces here today. I'm Mary Brabeck, and I'm Dean of the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. And I would like to start our breakfast on a sober note. We learned yesterday that Jay Oliva, the 14th president of New York University, has died. And I would like to start with a moment of silence in his memory. He was a great friend of the Steinhardt School. He was a great builder and leader for New York University. And this is a loss for our community. So let's remember him in a moment of silence. Thank you. As I said, it's great to see so many familiar faces. Once again, we bring together this for the 15th year in our Ed Policy Breakfast. We bring together people who come from State Department Education, from our Department of Education in New York City. We have people who are researchers, students, scholars, policymakers, the press, and members of unions, members of advocacy groups, members of teachers' advocacy groups, and again, students. I'm really happy to see so many of our NYU students here. So welcome. This year we're asking you to participate in our social media experience here and share your thoughts, your comments, your questions, your exclamation marks, your selfies. Please participate, and please take a look at our website on the Ed Policy Breakfast. We videotape all of these breakfasts, and the previous ones on testing this year are available for you to view, and we would ask you to do that. We also ask you to help us think about next year's Ed Policy Breakfast, and you'll see these NYU violet slips on your table. And we ask you to fill them out, give us some ideas of what should be the topics for next year. Topics that we have covered over the last decade include, of course, this year's series on testing, last year's series on Common Core standards. We've looked at teacher effectiveness, we've looked at closing the achievement gap, we've looked at transitions from preschool to first grade, from middle school to high school, from high school to college and work, and STEM education, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. What should we do next? Please participate and let us know. You can drop those slips of paper in the box that's on the table as you walk out, or you can leave them at the table and we'll pick them up, but please fill them out. And as you're walking out with your violet slips, please pick up our NYU Steinhardt propaganda packets. We want you to see who are the new faculty who joined us in Steinhardt this year. This is the best statement about the future of our school, so people who have joined us, and you can see what kinds of people we are hiring. This is our music and performing arts calendar. Our music department of 1,600 students is busy with recitals and performances, so please take a look at this and join us for everything from storytelling to symphony orchestra. Take a look at what we call our brag sheets. These are the honors and the awards that our faculty and students have received, and our newsletter, which tells you what's going on in the school, including news on the Ed Policy Breakfast, which will be in a forthcoming issue also. And don't forget your NYU Steinhardt bookmark. Everyone should have one by the bedside. Okay. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. We are looking at testing, as you know, the benefits, the consequences, and today we're looking at what are the best policies for New York City, for New York State, for our nation. We have talked about this in our last two Ed Policy Breakfasts, and I think we're at a point where we know that teachers teach to the test, and we know that students learn to the test. I mean, how many of you either heard or said, is it on the test? Do I really have to know this for the exam? We were hearing that a lot this particular month as exams are rolling out on campus here. So we anticipate an informed and a spirited discussion, as we always have in the past. And I would ask you, to welcome our moderator for our discussion this morning, Dr. Pedro Noguera. Let me tell just a few things about Pedro. Pedro is the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education in the Steinhardt School. He is a sociologist, and his research focuses on the social and economic conditions that affect schooling and on how to improve education, particularly for children in poverty and for students of color. He's the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education, known as the Metro for everybody around New York and other parts of the country. And he was appointed by the governor of New York State to the CUNY Trustees Board and served there from 2008 to 2011. He has written too many books for me to recite here, but I'll mention a few. They include Creating the Opportunity to Learn, Moving from Research to Practice to Close the Achievement Gap. Invisible No More, Understanding and Responding to the Disenfranchisement of Latino Males, and he's written the book, The Trouble with Black Boys, Reflections on Race, Equity, and the Future of Public Education. You will recognize his voice because he's a frequent commentator on NPR and on MSNBC and CNN. He has had many awards that speak to his reputation as a scholar and an advocate for children in K-12 education, including honorary degrees from Metropolitan College of New York, Bank Street College, and the University of San Francisco. He is particularly appropriate for moderating our discussion about testing policies because he also has been the chair of the board of the Oakland School Board in Oakland, California. So he will help us discuss this question and raise questions in a way that allows lots of people to participate. I just ask you to keep your questions coming with a question mark at the end. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome. I want to thank all of you for coming out and particularly thank Dean Brabeck for her introductory remarks. This will be our last year with Dean Brabeck as Dean. She will join the faculty again, and I just want to say Steinhardt's really benefited under her leadership and grown in many important ways. So I just want to thank you, Mary, for all you've done for Steinhardt and for NYU. Charlotte Frank, if you don't know, is over here, and she pointed out to me that I didn't wear a tie this morning. I said, that's one of the benefits of being a professor, is you don't have to wear a tie all the time. But I didn't think she was approving when she said that, so I'm going to have to. But again, thank all of you for coming out. We have an interesting panel assembled, interesting in that they represent different perspectives on the topic. I remember when we were thinking about this session over a year ago, I was saying that, we need to really think about assessment as a tool. We've been using assessment, I would say, largely as a means to measure, to monitor school performance, to rate teachers now. The one thing you don't hear nearly enough about is how we use assessment to diagnose learning needs in children and how to give good feedback to teachers on how to meet the learning needs of students. And so we're hoping today we're going to broaden the conversation about assessment. I'm going to hear from both researchers and practitioners who are in the trenches and have been thinking deeply about how to do this and how to do this well. We're also going to hear today from a new leader at the Department of Education, Phil Weinberg, who I'll introduce in a moment, who said ahead of time, listen, this is just barely past the 100-day mark, so we're still kind of crafting our policies. So although many of us are anxiously waiting to hear what those will be, I'm not sure if he's ready yet to give the full overview, but I think we'll get a glimpse this morning. So let me start with the introductions. We have Ann Cook today. Ann is the Executive Director of the New York Performance Standards Consortium, a coalition of 39 New York State public high schools that has developed and implemented a performance-based system of graduation-level assessment in lieu of high-stakes testing. The Consortium's system is the model for innovative assessment initiatives now underway in other states. Ms. Cook is the co-founder of the Urban Academy Laboratory High School, the award-winning anchor school located at the Julia Richmond Education Complex in New York City. She has taught students from K-12 as well at Sarah Lawrence College and the City University of New York. She writes and speaks about education reform and is the author of 3 series of children's books, as well as serving as the editor to Teacher publications, distributed by Teachers College Press. She serves as a board member of Fair Test and is the parent of 3 children who graduated from New York City public schools. We're also joined by Phil Weinberg, who I mentioned. Phil is now the Deputy Chancellor for Teaching and Learning at the New York City Department of Education. In this new role, Phil will lead the work to strengthen instruction and enhance student learning at the city's 1,700 schools. This will include professional development for teachers, ensuring strong educator school quality, and fostering collaboration among and between schools. Prior to his appointment, he was an educator for 28 years, 26 of which were at the High School of Telecommunication Arts and Technology in Brooklyn, where he served as an English teacher, assistant principal, and most recently as the school's principal for 13 years. During his tenure as principal, he created an academically rigorous learning environment for students by encouraging teachers to continuously collaborate as they strengthen their instruction, guided by the Common Core. Under his leadership, the school had a 4-year graduation rate. It rose from 61% in 2005 to 86% in 2012. And its college readiness rate, as defined by CUNY scores on the Regents, rose 52%. In 2012, Phil received the Sloan Public Service Award from the Fund for the City of New York, an award given to 6 civil servants each year whose outstanding work to serve the city goes above and beyond the call of duty. Our third panelist is Frank Worrell. Frank is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and the Psychology Department at the University of California, Berkeley. His areas of expertise include academic talent development and gifted education, the education of at-risk youth, scale development and validation, teacher effectiveness, and the translation of psychological research findings into school-based practice. Professor Worrell is an active member of several professional organizations. He's currently one of the Division 16 school psychology representatives, co-author of the Review of Education Research, a fellow of Division 5, Evaluation, Measurement, and Statistics, and I can go on and on. Many different important professional associations. In 2012, Professor Worrell received a presidential citation from the American Psychological Association and the Chancellor's Award for Advancing Institutional Excellence from UC Berkeley. And he received the 2013 Distinguished Scholar Award from the National Association of Gifted Children. He has ongoing collaborations in Germany, Iran, Italy, New Zealand, Nigeria, Peru, and the United Kingdom. Thank you, Frank, and also a former colleague from Berkeley. And then lastly, we are going to be joined, this is a special participant in that she was asked only recently, and that was after her op-ed appeared in the New York Times. Liz Phillips, she is the principal of PS 321, the William Penn School in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and she's been there for 15 years. On April 9th, she published a letter in the Times called "We Need to Talk About the Test, a Problem with the Common Core." I don't know if we have a copy of that article with us today, but I'm sure you can find it online if you want to look it up, the letter that Liz wrote. Very compelling statement, I think, about the way testing is being used and experienced in school. That's one of the things that we hope to explore today, which is the ways in which policy and practice are often divided and separated, and how those who are involved in implementing policies experience them on the ground. So with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to come join me on the stage. We're going to do things a little bit differently this morning, in that not everyone has a PowerPoint or a traditional presentation. So we're going to use a more of an informal discussion format among the panelists. Since Frank came from furthest away, and Frank, I don't mean to put Frank in a defensive position here, but is going to uphold the importance of assessment. We thought that we would give Frank the first shot. So, Frank?
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Dean Brabeck and Dr. Noguera and the Steinhardt School for inviting me here to be on this distinguished panel, and to thank Eric Narberg for dealing with me as a very spacey professor who kept changing things on him. So, briefly, in defense of tests, I guess, and I'd say in defense of assessment. Although not all tests are well developed, nor are all testing practices wise and beneficial, there's extensive evidence documenting the effectiveness of well-constructed tests for uses supported by validity evidence. And when I say tests here, I'm not necessarily talking about the regions. I'm not defending any particular type of test. It could be a performance assessment. It could be any kind of assessment. But I think it's really important for us to recognize that, in fact, tests are important. And, in fact, as Dr. Noguera pointed out, they're important not just for summative assessment, but, in fact, they're important for formative assessment as well, diagnosing. So there's sort of three brief points I want to make today. Teachers are among the most important contributors to student learning, but we know that some teachers are less effective than others. There are many students who are not learning in our school systems. That's why we have these conversations, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and I would argue, as somebody who studies gifted and talented youth as well, there are many gifted and talented youth who, however you define gifted, who are not learning as well. And lastly, that school systems and teachers need to use appropriate assessments to evaluate both student performance, but also their own performance as a standard practice. So, among the first point, teachers are important. Taking this from the Sanders and Rivers piece, which started off a lot of the value-added furor a couple of decades ago, and basically what this graph shows is that if you have poor teachers for 3 years in a row versus highly effective teachers for 3 years in a row, two different school systems, we can see that there's a tremendous difference, in fact, in student outcomes. And these outcomes are standardized test scores. These are not, these are not the tests that the teachers are necessarily teaching to. So these are percentile ranks that the students who have effective teachers 3 years in a row are doing a lot better than the ones who have poor teachers 3 years in a row, and everywhere in between. Moreover, when we do a summary of the evidence, John Hattie did a meta-analysis, which was published in 2009, looking at over 800 meta-analyses that were in the literature on a variety of topics, and identifying the interventions that, in fact, make a difference in student learning. So those that have effect sizes that are greater than 0.40, most of them involved teaching. Formative evaluation, which in fact is one type of teachers using formative evaluation, micro-teaching, teacher clarity. There's a host of these things: repeated reading, teaching creativity, teaching metacognition, controlling classroom behavior, classroom climate. All of these things are under the control of teachers, and I would argue actually that, for instance, controlling classroom behavior and classroom climate are things that, in fact, you learn not just from looking, but you learn from the students themselves who actually have a sense of what's going on in the classroom. And interestingly enough, these variables, the only things that trump these variables are IQ and prior student achievement. Those are the only ones that are comparable. So, I mean, in some sense, then, the single largest factor related to academic growth in populations, student populations, is teacher effectiveness. These, the effectiveness is both cumulative and additive, and the top group of teachers actually support all students at all levels, low income, different SES groups, and so forth. We know then that despite all of this, that there are many students who are not being well served. And this is a problem. We have all seen graphs like these where we see the test scores and the differences, African American, American Indian, Latino students having lower scores than students of European American and some Asian American backgrounds. But more importantly than the score itself is what that score means. I think that if the low scores reflected proficiency, so that we were going from proficiency upward, we'd probably be much less concerned about the disparity in scores. But the low scores represent, in fact, a lack of proficiency. And in fact, what this graph is showing is that the majority of African Americans and Latino students, they are actually in the below basic category. So that these are students who are not able to read. And we know students who cannot read fluently by grade 4 are tremendously likely to end up dropping out of school, end up in jail. I mean, there's a host of consequences that are going on. But this is something that, in fact, we have not yet been able to deal with. When we look at the percentage of students scoring advanced in grade 4, for example, across the country, as you can see, the majority of the country, fewer than 5%, are scoring in the advanced level. And there are many of them who are, and very, very few have states have 13% or more scoring at the advanced levels. This is we like to call ourselves the leader of the free world and all of these other things, the last superpower, but these data actually are really appalling and speak to a tremendous crisis. And finally, assessment is important in evaluating student performance and teacher performance. I'd like to point out, I mean, diagnosis is important, and I would agree with Dr. Noguera. I think that, in fact, we need to start, assessments and tests need to start with diagnostic assessment. If you are teaching something, you need to know what your students know. You need to then teach, and then you need to evaluate, did they learn what you taught? And then if they did not, you go back. This assessment instruction cycle is one that's really should be at the heart of everything that we do. But at the end of the school year, we also need to know that the students are retaining what they know. So we need assessment not just through the diagnostic process, but as we move forward across the year. It's also important to get student perspectives. One of my colleagues, Rona Weinstein, Professor Emerita at UC Berkeley, has studied teacher expectation effects for many, many years, and their work has shown very clearly that there are teachers who have high expectations for students and low expectations for students. And in fact, there are teachers who have high expectations for some groups, right, the Asian Americans and European Americans, and low expectations for other groups. And in the classrooms where teachers have these disparities in expectations, right, that we find that there are between 0.75 and 1 standard deviations higher in terms of achievement for teacher expectations for Asian Americans than for African Americans and Latinos. And in the high bias classrooms, the end of year achievement gap, 0.38 standard deviations of the year end achievement gap is explained across ethnicity. Now, I know there's a lot of concern about whether students should be rating teachers. I mean, that has created a lot of alarm. And I'm not advocating that we should do this in terms of necessarily evaluating teachers, although I think they are useful in evaluating teachers. The question for me is, can students really evaluate teachers effectively? And I would suggest that they can. If we think about the fact that many of the diagnoses that we make, as my students make as school psychologists, learning disability, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, teachers rate students. And the teachers are seeing 20 to 30 students in their classrooms. Well, the students are seeing one teacher in front of them. They're seeing that teacher all the time. And when we look at asking students to predict teacher effectiveness, we often say if this class is easy, that's going to be what the students are going to rate. But as this graph shows, the thing that's most predictive of teacher effectiveness as rated by students is teacher clarity. Have they communicated the information that they're supposed to communicate in mathematics, reading, as the case may be, most clearly? And so that, and I think that's the end of, those are the end of my remarks. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Frank. Sure. And thanks for getting us started. I'm gonna turn to Ann Cook, and Ann, you have a choice to either, because I know you also have a PowerPoint that you can either share with us now, or you can wait because she's holding back. But Ann represents, as you heard in the introduction, a very different approach to how to think about assessment. She's been working with a consortium of schools that have been doing performance-based assessment for many years. And I wonder, Ann, if you could start by sharing what are some of the things we're learning about how to use assessment and how that impacts student learning and student college readiness.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for the comments. I think the overall word I would use is engagement. In order for students to do well, they have to be engaged. And I think, as you might imagine, and I think as we'll hear later, it's hard to get engaged in the 3 to 8 or 9 to 12 tests. And I think that it's much more effective to actually look at students' writing, to actually look at the work that they do, to actually listen to them, and to try to see what it is that really turns them on. I think what you find is that if you hit it right, they can produce and perform at a much higher level than we ever thought possible. And I would argue that after 40 years plus of tests which are becoming more and more high stakes, we have very little to show for it. You know, it's sort of like what Lillian Katz, who's a very well-known early childhood educator, says. She said, we're doing earlier and earlier to children what we shouldn't do later. And I think that's really quite profound. Because I think that what we find is that the top is still the top, the bottom is still the bottom. If you need any evidence or proof of that, all we have to do is look at the high school specialized exam in New York City, which recently tested 20,000 high school, prospective high school students for the Stuyvesant Science Brooklyn Tech entry. And we had this year 7 African American students who gained entry to Stuyvesant. That's really shocking. And I think that it isn't a testament to their intelligence or their ability. I think it's an indictment of our inability to be creative, to find other ways for students to demonstrate what it is they know and can do. So I think one of the things that we have found is that if you do that, you actually do a number of things at the same time. If you change the way assessment is done, and you move it to actually student performance, and you have a system which is practitioner-driven, student-focused, and externally assessed, what you end up with is a better quality of teaching, a much more interesting curriculum, a much more engaged student, and you also end up with students performing at a much higher level in terms of graduation, in terms of college entrance, and more importantly than college entrance, college persistence. So I'll stop there, and we can kind of go further with that in a little while.
Okay, so she has some information looking at those schools over time and how they've impacted the students they serve. We'll come back to a little while later. Phil, I'd like to turn to you now, and I know you're new in the role, but I know that from having heard the Chancellor most recently this past Saturday, that there is some rethinking going on about how we're going to use assessment. And we also know that there were some protests led by some principals in the area over the way the tests are being used. So if you could share with us now, again, I realize that in some ways the policies and positions are still being formulated, some of the thinking going on about how to use assessment to guide instruction and to guide some of the directions we're going to be seeing taken in New York City.
Sure, Pedro. The easiest way for me to answer that question, or to start, is to talk about my experiences as principal. The goal.
I think you have to speak into the mic too.
The goal we have in terms of assessment is to use assessment as a tool for learning and to use what we learn to guide our instruction. We need to make sure that as we assess what we want our students to learn, we need to assess for where we want our students to go and how we want students to learn. We have to use assessment as a way to guide instruction and as a way to allow ourselves to adjust what we do in order to make sure we best serve the needs of our students. The Common Core provides us with a roadmap for where we might want to go. It's a nice set of skills, inarguable in terms of what we want students to do, to be thinkers for themselves, but it's nothing other than a roadmap. What we need is the ability to get into our classrooms, find out where our students are, figure out what skills they need in order to move along that continuum of skills, assess for what they lack assess for what they can do, and adjust our instruction accordingly. Assessment has to serve as a tool for learning and a tool and a guide for teaching.
Okay. All right. And so how do we make sure that because teachers have been kind of inundated with data, how do we make sure that teachers actually know how to use that data to make decisions, informed decisions about how to meet the learning needs of students?
I think we're at a point in our history where this is an opportunity for us to get better at this. We have to start to use the information available to us to ask ourselves questions and to learn from it. As a school, what we did was we tried to formulate assessments that spoke to the 1,300 young people in our building and assess whether they were moving in a direction we wanted them to move. When we started doing this 3 years ago, we didn't do a great job. We argued with each other, we fought, we were disappointed in some of the information we got, but we got better at it over time. And by the time this January came around, I felt like we were in a better spot about being able to speak to each other about where we were going with our instruction. It drove us as a faculty to talk to each other more in a more detailed manner about what we were doing in our classrooms and why we were doing it and how we could support each other. My sense is that as a school system, we need to do that as well. We need to start to speak to each other about what it is that we are trying to do, how we're trying to do it, and whether we can assess whether we've been effective or not, and whether we're willing and able to be honest with each other and say, you know, I don't think that worked. I got to try something else. What have you done that might have worked in terms of moving students in this way?
So I'm going to one more before I turn back to Frank. Your school, as we heard, it was a school that improved significantly, and that's a credit to your leadership and the work of your staff. But it's also, so I'm not sure to what degree what your school has been able to accomplish is indicative of what we could expect elsewhere. That's in part a question. The state of New York has identified several hundred schools in New York City that are underperforming and in need of improvement. My hunch is that these schools are not just staffed by lazy people, right? Although the assumption often, I think, from policy is that if we just apply more pressure, that they will be forced to improve. It seems like these schools actually need help in figuring out, okay, how do we meet the needs of these kids? So what does that help look like?
That help looks like a conversation that's focused on what it is, and it's the same conversation. Where are our students struggling? What can we be certain that we can, what should we try to do to help them to move along that continuum of skills that we know is important? Where can we find the resources to help us move along that continuum? Is it within our building as we turn to each other as a faculty? Is it in the school down the road from us? Have they done some work that has moved students? Is it in this room right here? Are there people in this room who can help the schools in the city that are struggling? We also need to have a more honest conversation about what we think struggling means. The state has a very specific definition. It tends to fall on schools that educate the neediest students in the state. New York City has the most of those students in the state. That might not be a perfectly well thought out definition of what struggling is. I think we have to get better as a system and as a community about being honest about what we see in our schools, about where we see progress and why we think progress is a valuable and effective part of what's happening in schools, and how we can celebrate progress, learn from progress, honestly look at places where we're failing, learn about what's causing that failure and how we can improve it, and work together to make sure that all students get the best education we can provide them.
Great, thank you. Frank, I'd like to go back to you now. The number of things that you said in your opening remarks speak to the issue of accountability and how testing serves as an accountability measure. And I think we get the sense now that the politicians like testing because it gives them data that they think is meaningful as a way to make judgments about schools and districts. We know, and I think Ann spoke to this already, that, and so did Phil, that where poverty is concentrated, it seems like test scores are almost always very low. And it seems like the assessments themselves don't tell us much about what to do about that. Now, so that's the first part of the question. How do we make sure that assessment's not just being used as a weapon against schools that serve high-need kids. And I would say that the related issue is disincentives for teachers to work with high-need kids. You implied, and you said repeatedly, that teacher was very important for changing outcomes. We know that there are certain groups of kids for whom generating higher achievement and growth is going to be much more difficult. How do we convince some of our best teachers to take on that work, knowing that they will be judged by the performance of their kids, and that getting those kids to experience growth may not be very easy or happen very quickly?
I think the first point to make is that the teacher exists in a system, and in fact, sort of judging teachers without looking at the whole structure within which they work is extremely problematic. So that if I actually want to make sure that the grade 2 teacher is doing a good job in raising those kids to a grade 3 standard or above, I need to ensure that those students are coming in to grade 2 with the grade 2 standard. So it bumps all the way down. And there are two types of assessment going on here. One is the assessment to judge teachers, and I think we need to separate both of them. So if we are talking about assessment about has this kid made a year's progress in a school year, that's one type of assessment. And one would argue that if in fact you have an effective teacher, that should be happening. The other type of assessment is, as you mentioned before, is the student learning as they're going along what they're supposed to learn, right? And so I would argue that if you have a poor teacher, right, that in point of fact, I'm trying to find my notes here on my phone. My students would be so proud that I actually thought about taking notes on my phone. Yeah, if you have a poor teacher, that whether you do performance assessment or testing at the end of the year, using those tests at the end of the year, that in point of fact, the students are not going to be good in either. That the idea is that teachers need to get information in a timely fashion that they can use it. When we give tests at the end of a year, those annual tests that states give, they're not very, very useful. They're not useful at all for teachers in terms of making instructional decisions. So the teachers need to be getting data, doing assessments over the course of the year to get information to move their kids forward.
That mean more testing?
No, it means actually in class assessments. So, and that's a part of what we do. If I'm teaching kindergarten, right, and the response to intervention movement in school psychology is really supposed to address this. If I'm teaching kindergarten, I know if I have a kid who in October does not know, cannot hear that bird and bus start with the same sound, that kid is on way to being diagnosed with a learning disability in grade 3. But by knowing this in kindergarten, I can intervene and teach that, right? So that's the use of testing within the classroom context to actually get students to know what they're supposed to know. And if we don't use assessment that way, it's not very useful for teachers or for the states, right? And so this idea that testing itself is bad is not the issue here, right? The issue is, are we doing the right kind of test at the right time, right? So at the end of grade 2, do you know your grade 2 curriculum? But in the first week of grade 2, do you know the stuff? Do you remember the stuff from grade 1 that I need to build on? That's the important question. And we need to teach teachers how to use data, right? They're not going to know how to do it. I mean, and that speaks to teacher education, right? Which we have not been doing. We need to teach teachers how do you use data.
But we have a political challenge here in New York. In 2009, we were led to believe that New York had made incredible progress in closing the achievement gap. I think it was 80% of schools in New York City were rated at a level A or B. And we were just like in heaven. Wow, New York is so much progress. Now, it did coincide with Mayor Bloomberg's third term re-election, so it was kind of convenient. And then right after that, we were told, no, the scores have to be recalibrated. And actually, our kids are doing terribly, and we're not making that much progress. And so now we've been told that the common cure, the common core will be the cure. that will save us. So I guess the political question I want to ask is about how do we help our policymakers to understand the complexity. In New York City, we serve large numbers of English language learners, some of whom arrive in this country with limited literacy in their native language. Those are kids that typically will not experience a year of growth in their first year of learning. How do we hold teachers accountable using tests when we know very well from all the research on learning and language acquisition that that kind of growth is not typical?
We vote them out of office. I mean, at the end of the day, politicians are actually working to the next election cycle. And they want to give good news. One of the things that we don't have, and oftentimes we as a public are responsible, if we want, schooling and learning involves work. If we want kids to learn, they've got to work, right? The teachers have got to teach, the kids have got to work to learn, right? At the engagement, Anne is very right, engagement is, I think, key. In fact, kids who are engaged, of course, are much more likely to pursue the learning that they need to do. But when we raise standards, every time we raise standards, scores are going to go down. They are going to go down by necessity because, in fact, we are recalibrating. And what typically happens is that we raise standards and then the scores go down, but we don't give the schools and the teachers a time to catch up. We back off, right? And in fact, we then recalibrate the standards and so that in point of fact, we sort of undermine the very thing that we need to do. That being said, the Common Core, the Common Core is coming in to increase critical thinking and all of those kinds of things. The previous set of standards came in to do the same thing, right? This is not new. This is what we've always been concerned about. The Common Core in and of itself will not solve the problem. The problem has to be solved in the classroom by allowing teachers to learn what they're supposed to do, building informative assessments, and providing the kinds of supports that schools and teachers need. We at Berkeley started a charter school, and one of the things we found out is that, especially for kids who are below grade level, you cannot have academic rigor. You can't get to the level of performances you need without providing academic support, social emotional support, and you've got to provide a range of supports as these students struggle to get up to grade level and then continue to have them so. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be successful. And so that goes way beyond the test. It goes to restructuring the entire system of educational supports.
Let me turn back to you, Anne, because you talked already about the importance of engagement and the importance of really looking for evidence that our students are prepared. We have ample evidence in New York City that large numbers of kids who pass tests are unprepared for college, are required to take remedial courses in college for which they get no credit. And so it's pretty clear that what we've been doing has not prepared those students. What are you learning from your work in the consortium about looking for evidence that might shed light on a different approach to preparing kids for college?
Well, you're standing next to the computer so you can punch the right buttons, look at some data. I just want to make one comment. I think we're muddying the waters here to kind of to take the word tests and group everything under tests. I don't think anybody who teaches has any problem with teacher-driven tests. We test all the time. The consortium school teachers are testing in all kinds of ways. We're talking here about a distinction between teacher tests, classroom tests, instructional tests, and norm-referenced or criterion-referenced standardized high-stakes testing. That's a big difference. And I want to say something about the use of data. Teachers in New York City, and I suspect it's true across the state, they don't even get the results of the tests until long after the kids have moved on. So this instructional value of these high-stakes tests is quite difficult to understand. So I just think it's important when we use this term test that we are very careful about how we define what we're talking about, because we don't use the standardized tests to measure whether kids are ready for graduation and ready to move on. We use a very different system, and it is a system, and it involves a lot of presentation on the part of the students, a lot of revision. I think most of the schools in the consortium have established what I would call a culture of revision, which is very unusual. Kids don't think that they've written a paper and that's the end of it. They think that they have to go back and look at what the comments were from the teacher in order to improve the product and in order to be able to explain what their work is across the subject disciplines. So let's take a look at a little bit of what we're finding. The first slide is really just to kind of establish that what we have here is actually a system. We're not talking about a portfolio that just is a collection of kids' work. We're really talking about a system that involves professional development, involves rubrics, involves revision of the rubrics, involves external assessors on several different levels, involves oral presentation, and involves an enormous amount of PD, both in the school, and through the Consortium Center for Inquiry. So that's just to kind of give you a sense of where it's all coming from. The students in the consortium are all required to do 4 tasks. At a minimum, this is across the schools. And in addition to the 4 tasks, the schools add on additional tasks that they require for graduation. So the first task that you see there is a literary analysis. Then there's a social studies research paper. There's an original science experiment. There's an application of mathematical understandings. And all of those involve extensive writing and presentation and external reviewers of the work. So then there are rubrics that are used to look at the work and to filter what it is that's actually going on in the papers. Interestingly enough, we do moderation studies. We publish collections of the work. We bring together 150, 200 teachers every year to blind grade, regrade the papers that are used for graduation, to fulfill the graduation requirements. Those papers are also sent out to colleges for students in those colleges and faculty in the colleges to look at. And we will do things like bundle up a whole bunch of social studies paper and send them off to Eric Foner, take the grades off, ask him what his view of these papers. He's a professor at Columbia. So there are a number of different ways that we're trying to make sure that we have reliability. Then and just to make one comment, this is just, you can see the rubrics in detail. If you go onto the website, they're all there. We're very transparent about what it is we're looking for. And I might say that the rubrics are actually reviewed by teams of teachers and external consultants every 2 years. So we go back and look to see whether we think we're asking the right questions or looking for the right kinds of evidence in the papers and in the presentations that the students are doing. So let's think about who are these students. The students are very typical of New York City kids. In fact, overall, we have a more disadvantaged population. So we have a slightly higher percentage of kids in poverty, and we have a higher percentage of students with special needs, and we have a higher percentage of students who score below grade level on the 8th grade ELA in math. So if you look at the graduation data for the consortium students exceeds, we're looking at the city to make the comparisons. And so we're looking at what the city data shows. So that although the kids in the consortium schools start school with a lower academic achievement, higher rates of poverty, and a larger percentage of minority students in overall New York City schools, they graduate and attend college at a higher percentage. The consortium schools graduate twice as many special ed students than the larger school system, twice as many, and 40% more English language learners. We have 3 schools in the consortium and 12 schools that are pilot schools that are entirely ELL students. Consortium graduates stay put when they get to college. They persist. You can look at the next slide, Pedro. They persist into their 2nd year of college at both 4-year and 2-year institutions at rates 93% and 83% that exceed New York State and national rates. A 3-year study that was reported in Phi Delta Cap and followed 660 of the consortium graduates into their 3rd semester of college It's interesting, we don't look at kids in their second, at the end of their second semester. That's where the big drop-off occurs in colleges across the country. So we looked at their third, are they there in their third semester? And we looked at where they went to school. We found that 77% of them attended the four-year colleges, 19% attended two-year colleges, and 4% attended the vocational or technical college programs. And of the kids attending four-year colleges, 83% were enrolled in colleges that were described by Barron's as competitive or highly competitive. And I'm going to say that, you know, what we've said from the beginning, I might say we take one of the Regents exams. We take the ELA. And we also do an English language analysis, so we have 4 of the assessments, and the ELA is one of them. So we don't really trust the ELA scores, but obviously they need that in order to be able to get a Regents diploma. That has been determined by the Regents. So a number of these students in the consortium schools are first-generation college-going, and they have been able to, and that includes the L kids. It is remarkable to hear students graduating from these English language learning schools in their senior year make oral presentations. I take them everywhere. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't bring them here this morning. They are just incredible in terms of their ability to explain their work, to talk about why they're able to learn in an environment where there's less direct instruction from the teacher and a much more conversation and discussion in the classroom. And so I think it's important also to look at the number of minority students, African American males, and Hispanic students that go on to college, which is what this slide shows. And in addition, we look at how the teachers, in terms of retention, is that the retention slide?
This is the suspension data.
Okay, suspension data. I can't see it from here. You know, we looked at whether these schools were places that students would want to be, and where there's a lot fewer incidents than you would find across other schools. And what we found was that the consortium schools had 5% of suspension rate, as compared with, say, 12% in the charter schools or 11% in the New York City schools. In terms of teacher turnover data, we looked at that because for us, teachers need to stay in the system. They need to get better and better at what they do. They need to be experienced, try things out, work with other teachers. And what we found is that the turnover in these schools is 15% compared to 58% for the New York City schools. So in other words, we're only losing 15%, we're retaining 85% in comparison to the New York City schools, which are losing 58%. So I think that in terms of whether we're succeeding in actually getting a better educated student, and we have some evidence to show that we are, we're creating different environments in the schools, we're doing a better job making teaching a profession where the professionals are really interested and want to stick with it and feel that this is something that they're interested in doing and they enjoy doing and that they become good at doing. So I think that on a lot of different levels, we're doing a better job at doing what I think schools are supposed to do.
All right. Thank you for that. And now I attended a meeting that you convened with the state commissioner, I think it was almost 2 years ago, where you presented this data, and I think he was also impressed. But to our surprise, he did not think that we should do this in more schools. Could you explain what's preventing us? If this data, I mean, this data is very compelling. Why are we not doing this? Why are we limiting this to 38 schools? Why aren't we taking this elsewhere? Well, and then I'm going to ask Phil if the DOE would embrace that, but we'll go to him.
Actually, it's an interesting distinction because the DOE has been very supportive. So I think in many cases the DOE was responsible for suggesting a number of what we call the pilot schools. These are schools that are seeking to be covered under the consortium's work. You know, I think it's a political question. I think that it doesn't have an educational answer. At least I don't have an educational answer. I think there is a tendency across the country to want some system that's one size fits all. It's much more tidy and neat. And I think one of the things that's important about the consortium schools and the students is that when we set up, for example, the tasks, what we're saying is students have to demonstrate, just as an example, that they can write a research paper in the social sciences that has a number of important qualities, that they know how to support an argument, that they can handle multiple perspectives, that they're able to cite their sources, that they're able to find evidence and know how to make a judgment about evidence, and that they find their own voice around a topic. We're not particularly worried about the topic. The topic comes out of the classroom. And I think that that's in opposition to standardization. So for example, if I was to tell you what are some of the topics that students have used, here's some. Should India's untouchables receive affirmative action? Emmett Till and Trayvon Martin, how far have we come? A literary analysis, how society influences who you are and who you become, an analysis of Kindred by Octavia Butler and Passing by Nella Larson. Equality in times of war, examining Euripides' Medea. Neuroscience, the effect of rock and roll jazz or silence on studying algebra. Ecology, the effect of antifreeze on the duckweed growth, population growth. I could go on and on. There's just hundreds of these. And it's the rubrics that give us the ability to look to see whether kids are able to marshal the qualities of a good, well-written paper. That is why I think when the kids go on to college, they are completely comfortable when some professor says to them, you need to write a 7-page, a 10-page, a 15-page paper. They have no problem with that. And I think that the problem with the state is that they're looking for a formula. They're looking for standardization so that they can make certain kinds of comparisons. And I think that what it does is the bottom drops out in terms of student involvement and engagement and effectiveness and success.
Yeah. And as a parent, I've sent 2 of my kids to these schools, Beacon and School of the Future, and can attest to the powerful learning that occurs through the revise, resubmit process that students are going through when they're doing this work and writing. And I know I see a few graduate students, revising and resubmit is often a painful process, but is actually where the real learning occurs. Phil, where does the DOE, I mean, the DOE has this work going on at many of your schools. You've talked already about the importance of schools learning from each other. Are there things that the schools that are not in the consortium could be learning and could emulate from these schools?
I think there's a lot to learn from these schools and from many other schools in our school system. We've begun a program called the Learning Partners Program. We have begun establishing partnerships among schools where best practices in one school are going to be studied by 2 other schools. There's going to be a kind of inter-school collaboration that will bring people back and forth in and out of each other's buildings, large groups of teachers and school leaders, so that we can study and talk about the ways in which we can take a practice and translate it from one school to another. The interesting thing about this conversation is we have 1,800 schools in the city. We probably, as Ann said, don't have the ability to standardize in a way that we can say, here's the answer for the 1,800 schools, this is what we'll do. But we have the ability to engender conversations with each other about what it is that's working, why it's working in particular places, and to find a way to make sure we can translate those practices to places where they will fit. In some ways, the conversation about the politics of education is a difficult one to translate to our conversation about practices. There's an intersection of the earth and some soil and nutrients and sun and care that Beth and I are pretty lazy about studying. But if we were studying it, if we were looking to graduate a better crop of potatoes, we probably could. And I think that's what we want to do with our schools. We want to make sure that we know what it is that we put in, what it is that's in our control, what it is that we can do differently, and we want to experiment with that. What does happen if we, for instance, lower class size? What does happen if we have a different kind of writing instruction in a high school? What does it look like? when we intervene early with our assessments and try to make sure that we use the assessment as a tool for learning, as a tool for growth, rather than as a tool for accountability. Can we translate some of those practices from my backyard potato to 1,800 different schools? I think we can, but I do think, as Frank says, it's work. It's work for us as adults. We have to embrace it. We have to say we don't know what we're doing all the time, and we're going to study, and we're going to be able to be unsure, and we're going to be able to make mistakes. And we have to be able to turn to our students and say, these assessments are not bad for you. This is not something for you to run away from. This is not something for you to be scared of. We're in this together. Me, your teacher, I want you to do this because I want to learn about you. And I want you to do the best that you can on this, and I want you to show me what you know, and I want you to show me what I haven't taught you, so that I can get better at teaching you what it is that I haven't taught you. We need to be honest with each other about that stuff.
I love the potato metaphor, and I imagine you now as the farmer in charge of this garden of 1,800 schools and growing our children up. And I would also imagine using that metaphor that if some of them don't grow, you don't blame them and say, we're going to shut you down for not growing properly. Right? You take a different strategy.
You find more manure.
Now, all right, well, so it seems, looking at the landscape of New York, there's a whole lot of manure needed out in East New York and in South Bronx, and that corresponds a lot to poverty. What does the DOE strategy look like for addressing the way in which poverty is undermining some of the performance of our kids in our schools?
I mean, it would be impossible for me to talk about what the DOE strategy is regarding poverty. I think that's a question for us as a city, as a state, as a nation. The intersection of poverty and of school choice, the intersection of poverty and of achievement are gigantic questions. And for me to even posit that I'd be making a policy statement for the DOE right now would be foolish. But I do think that in this room, in Tweed in our 1,800 schools, and in the living rooms of the families who make up the city, we do have to look to each other, at each other, and ask each other questions about whether we're really willing to address the question. Are we willing to look at our enrollment patterns and think about whether or not they speak to our best selves as a city? And are we willing to talk about the ways in which poverty has been a difficult part of our education system for years and years and years? And has been talked about in ways not directly. But that's me as a person speaking. I think that we will address this as a school system over time after more than 100 days, I think. 2 months for me. But yeah.
Thank you. Brief, and then I want to get Liz Phillips into the conversation.
Well, I just want to, I think that one of the problems we have in a system that's as big as New York is that we really need to find a mechanism to support all kinds of things. We need diversity, we need choice, we need a lot of different kinds of programs to really touch the lives of students. And I just want to tell you one, sort of grounded story, as Pedro put it earlier, from the trenches. We had a school in New York called Co-op Tech. Now, out on the island, if you're from out on the island, or if you're in Westchester, you're very familiar with something called BOCES. And these are programs that have a vocational, technical aspect to them, where clusters of schools will join together, designate one school to offer certain kinds of technical and vocational programs to students that you can't really duplicate in every school. And they're pretty successful. They've been around for a while. New York never had one, but we got one with Co-op Tech. And Co-op Tech really provided 14 different kinds of programs for kids in computer repair, horticulture, culinary arts, all in one building. And the trick was, there was no register for Co-op Tech. The kids were on registers in high schools across the city, and it attracted particularly students for whom an academic program after high school was really not of interest or an option. And they needed to go out into the world of work because of their economic situation. And it was very successful. In fact, John Ferrandino, who was the Charlotte Newman, I think, was the originator of this program, figured out that one of the problems with vocational education is that it becomes obsolete so quickly. So he wanted to offer a program in welding. And he looked around the city and he said, oh, it's Con Ed that does most of the welding. I'm going to get Con Ed in to do the welding. And those kids did a 2-year program in welding. And when they left, they had apprenticeships at Con Ed, they had a union card, and they had a job. Now, the thing was that they went to their home school, or their registered school, in either the morning or the afternoon. And co-op tech was the other piece. And after a while, when we started to have more emphasis put on the tests and on the importance of, you have to pass 5 Regents exams to graduate and get a diploma in New York State, and the score of the test kept rising from 55 up to 65. Eventually, the students, particularly those who were the most academically challenged, these home schools began to get nervous. Said, wait a minute, we're losing these students half a day every day. And over time, we're not going to do very well on the state tests. And so they began pulling these kids back and beginning to say, we can't really afford, if we're going to keep our school open, we can't really afford to send kids off to this program. And so if you look at Co-op Tech, the building's probably going to be torn down. It's the white building on 96th and 1st as you go into the drive. And it has become an adult education program. It no longer does this kind of very innovative scheduling with the high schools. Now, that is a victim. Those kids are victims of a state policy that doesn't allow for give. It doesn't allow for alternatives that are really important for these kids to have. And in a system as big as New York, we really do need all kinds of schools. In fact, I just want to put in a plug here, we need some schools that are therapeutic communities, that don't make school and academia the issue, that really try to help kids who have really serious mental issues. We have a number of kids in the system who don't get adequate help. So I would just plead that in the conversation about assessment, that we broaden this out. I don't think there should be any discussions about what kinds of programs we have in the city that address the issue of school security without people from the Department of Health sitting at the table and talking about how are we going to get resources from the Department of Health to help students who have issues that they need help with. So it's a complicated kind of thing. I think we need to position these issues of assessment within a context that makes sense for the students that we have.
Thank you for sharing that. And that sad story about the tech programs and the ways, and unfortunately a story is playing out throughout the country. I want to turn to Liz, if you don't mind now, and you could probably use that mic. You're at a school where the potatoes grow very well, and but nonetheless, you decided to lead or participate in a protest against the test. So explain the thinking in Park Slope.
All right, well, I'm very happy to be here to be able to talk a little bit about principals and teachers' response to the state testing. And I completely agree with Ann that we have to separate out assessment that happens daily in any good school that we all believe in. We have to assess the kids daily. We have to understand where they are, where they came from, where they need to go. I think what happened, but it is the state test that we're really protesting against, and I want to give a few reasons why and talk about how this actually started. So our school, which is a high-performing school and a relatively privileged school in New York City, had embraced the Common Core standards, have embraced the Common Core standards for many years. But as somebody said, you know, they're a roadmap. They're not the answer. They have, what I like about them is that, one, they're brief. In the past, we've had standards that are hundreds and hundreds of pages for each grade level. And when you look at them, they're sensible. They make sense in terms of what I think most people would say kids need to be able to do in literacy, in math. We felt as a school that we had done everything right, that we had followed the idea that test prep really isn't the way we should be going. We don't really believe in test prep. We believe that great teaching every day, as John King said in a letter that he sent to superintendents in March, is the way to go. And last year, when we had the first new supposedly Common Core aligned tests, in fact, we were not so upset. We were more upset with the ELA. We thought there were real flaws in them, but we also understood they were the first year. We gave a lot of feedback. there were opportunities to speak out, and we, maybe naively, believed that the tests this year would be better. We didn't think they'd be transformed. We thought they would be somewhat improved, that they would give us some better idea. They were too long. We knew that. They were still too long. When we saw the ELA, 3 weeks ago or something, we were literally stunned. The teachers in my school could not believe how bad the tests were. And the problem is, because of the rule that we cannot release any questions, any passages until the state decides to release a few that they select, nobody who has not administered the test, I don't think you could believe how bad they are. I don't think if I hadn't seen them, I would have believed it. Really, we're not even supposed to be talking about the test, and I'm not going to reveal any any test questions or passages, but I feel as a responsible educator, citizen, that I need to say that what was being tested is not what we want kids to learn. What was being tested were whether kids could reread many, many paragraphs, figure out which of the 4 paragraphs best connected to a 5th paragraph. The questions were about structure of text. This is in 3rd grade. This is 8-year-olds, not about overall comprehension. If anybody were going to try to teach to this test, we would end up with illiterate children. And the test, the first day was bad. The second day was a little bit better in most grades. The 3rd day was one of the worst tests I have ever seen. And the 3rd grade in particular was absolutely outrageous. And when I went to pick up the tests we're a very large school, we have 1,475 kids, so testing takes over. So I was responsible for picking up the 3rd grade tests. The teachers were literally in tears. We have great teachers, and I couldn't agree more that great teachers are what we all need. They couldn't believe it. They said, this is not what I'm about. I feel like quitting. I feel like, this is an antithesis to what I believe in. And the teachers later that day, and it was the 3rd grade teachers who kind of were most motivated, they came to me and they said, we can't just stay silent. We have to do something. And many different ideas were thrown out by the 3rd grade teachers, including that they thought maybe all 3rd grade teachers across the city should not come to school the next day. That was one idea. But in the end, they said, what if we have a rally in front of school tomorrow morning? And I said, I think that's a great idea, because I absolutely agreed with them about the testing. And what was amazing is this happened at about 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. I wrote I took about 3 minutes to write it, and now it's been reprinted various places, but I had to get it out, so I wrote a paragraph to parents on we have a email bulletin saying we were having this rally to protest the ELA and the lack of transparency around it, and we invited them to join teachers and administrators before school in front of our building. And that was at 2 o'clock on Thursday. At 8 o'clock the next morning, we had close to 500 people in front of our school. We had incredible press coverage. I mean, we have a very active parent body that reached out to the press. And we are a big school, we're a diverse school. We have teachers who've been there 45 years. We have teachers who are new. There was not a teacher in the school who didn't feel that what we were being asked to do was almost immoral. So what happened then was very interesting. It happened, and it was absolutely not, Al Baker had a piece in the New York Times, I think either that Thursday or Friday, I think it might have been the Friday. He had interviewed some principals, but he had also gone to some school and interviewed children coming out of the test who said it was easy. Now, whenever a kid says a test is easy, you worry a little bit about what that means. But he took that on face value and wrote an article basically saying, kind of, what's the big deal? The kids said the test was easy. one of the things that happened as a result of a combination of our rally and that article is that other principals became incensed that anybody could think, having not seen the test and having talked to children, that this test was easy, no big deal. And so some principals in District 2 sent out a letter to their whole district, basically kind of crediting 321 with, starting all of this, but saying, we need to show that we agree that this was truly a horrible test, and people need to know it. And as a result, something like 38 schools across the city, a week later, they had time to organize for a week, held rallies last Friday, the Friday before vacation. And there has been and then I published an op-ed piece on April 10th that got an incredible response from actually across the country. I had principals calling me from California, Maryland, Connecticut saying, thank you, we're going through the same thing. One of the things I said in my op-ed is that we have to have transparency. Until parents and the general public can see what these tests are, nobody is really going to fight them except the educators, and we're not enough. We need to have more support. So very, very big push for making these tests public so that the public can see what, in fact, kids are being tested in. I also think that some other things that have come up that I wanted to comment on were that the accountability part of the state tests, in theory, yes, we all need great teachers, and in broad measure, can the test, if we're comparing like students, maybe tell us something? Yeah, in the old days, I've been principal 15 years, I always looked at the test. I always looked at the scores. I always compared classes and saw, was there a huge difference in how a particular fifth grade class, a particular fifth grade teacher's kids did on a test? And if there was, I could dig deeper and say, oh yeah, well that makes sense. That's because there were some kids in this class who, her mother died a week before the test, or whatever it was. Because when you're talking about a sample size of 25 to 30, one or two kids doing better or worse can throw things off tremendously. And I think, again, because it's neat, because it's clean, people believe that this data is meaningful in ways that it's not. When the TDRs were published, we saw how absolutely meaningless they were. We had a teacher, and we're a high-performing school, that many, many people, statisticians, say that these growth models work better in the middle, but that they don't work very well on either end with your lowest performing or your highest performing kids. And we have a lot of very high performing kids. So we had one teacher who is in our school known by every measure, by my observations, by parents, by kids, as being absolutely one of the best teachers in the school. Her children coming into fourth grade had an average performance level of 3.97. That's where the highest you could have is 4.5. A 3 is on grade level, a 4 is above grade level, so 3.97, very high. After the fourth grade test, the average was 3.92. Statistically insignificant. This put her in the 6th percentile of teachers in the city. Again, if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. Then there was talk about, well, the formulas are going to be different, they're going to be better on the state level. I just looked at some growth scores from last year, and a child whose score went from 4.4 or something in performance level, where 4.5 is the top, in fourth grade went down to 4.02 in fifth grade, and he's considered as not having made a year of progress. That's like saying if 1 year, in terms we understand, if you got a 98 on your, on your regents in 10th grade and a 94 in 11th grade, you haven't made a year of progress. So the data is terribly flawed. The tests are terribly flawed. We are not against assessment. We are not against accountability. But it is very, very upsetting that no one seems to be listening. And John King's statement, which happened to come out the same day that my op-ed came out, basically said the tests are fine, people are making a lot of noise and kind of depriving, people who are opting out are depriving their children of being evaluated properly. And again, I think that that kind of response is what has principals and teachers feeling we have to do something dramatic to make people listen.
Thank you, Liz. And I want to open up in a moment, but it was interesting when Commissioner King came to NYU to speak, he also brought Secretary Duncan with him, I think, for backup. And it was interesting because Secretary Duncan, a while ago, had dismissed some of the protest as being that of entitled suburban parents. And I think he might say, well, you're again proof that that's who's reacting. So we've heard a lot today about, and we haven't heard as an either or. I think no one's here said we shouldn't assess. The question is how we assess, how the information's used. But I think there's this disconnect between the way our policymakers are looking at this issue and the way people who are implementing it are experiencing it. And I'll just turn one more time to you, Frank. If you just comment on that before we open it back up to the audience.
Hi, yeah. I think there are a number of important points here. With regard to that particular issue and the 94, the 4.0, one of the things that we know, and in fact it hurts students who are academically talented, is that tests that don't have a high enough ceiling actually penalize students and teachers, because what happens is, so for example, that's why the talent search programs use the SAT with kids in elementary school, because you need to have a high enough ceiling to show growth. If you have kids who are near the top or at the top, and they continue to be at the top, in essence, it looks as if they've made no growth. So I think that's a really important point that many policymakers don't understand. I also would agree that, in fact, to the extent that the vendors who are doing their tests did not take comments from teachers and principals who actually are working with the students, they've made these are the people who, in fact, understand, and so you're supposed to take those things into consideration. So there are bad tests out there. I'm not here to defend bad tests, but I would say that the reason for the Common Core is not just because of the core part of it, but the common part of it. The US is one of the few countries in the world where we don't have national standards, right? And so UC Berkeley this year got 77,000 applications. UCLA was over 100,000, right? We don't have enough places for everybody. We've got to make choices. And so some tests are part of it, because an A at one school is not the same thing as an A at another school. And so that's another reason why common tests are useful. I would be willing to bet that the students in the consortium schools are actually going to do better on the test than some of the kids who are in schools that are not doing well, simply because they're getting effective teaching, they're learning about revision and being critical thinkers. Getting rid of tests doesn't solve the problem. What we need to do is get appropriate tests. And that's the problem. We need to get appropriate assessments. And our politicians appropriate assessments take a lot of time, and I think one of the things that has happened is that the Common Core, the idea of these tests, which is why some states have pulled out, is that the tests are being done very, very quickly to try to get something in place, and therefore not well developed.
Well, thank you for that. And I know we have a few folks in the audience from Pearson. I'm not going to call on them to defend the test, but since we've heard so much about the importance of helping our policymakers understand how testing should be used, I'm wondering if they could perhaps develop a test for policymakers, right? That they must pass before they're allowed to set education policies to prove and demonstrate that they're actually qualified to monitor our systems. But that's another breakfast, I think, that we have to talk about that one. So we're going to open up the floor to some questions, and you get the first one.
Hi, thank you so much for a very enlightening, wonderful panel discussion. My name is Dr. Paula Rosen. I'm a newspaper publisher. On Saturday, I was with Carmen Farina, Teachers College, Yesterday, I was with Carmen Farini at Harvard University, at Harvard, the Harvard Club. She makes the rounds. And she said some very compelling things. One of them was, we are resting on 4 pillars of education. And one of them, which I think we can all relate to, is teacher education and how do we get everybody on board. And she spoke about teachers visiting each other, not teachers, but principals, visiting each other and collaborating. And I want to go from the general now to the very specific. How do you suggest, and this is addressed to the panel and to Liz as well, how do you suggest that we get the principals together, the actual specifics, and how do they share what the best practices are in a school? Because we can all agree that it's the teacher and the principal that make the big difference in our children.
So let me let Phil answer that one, because I know that's part of the innovations that the DOE's introduced, and I actually know Cristina Fuentes, right, who was leading that initiative, was a very highly effective principal in Brooklyn before coming to the DOE, to Tweed.
So the Learning Partners Program, which is the first way we're going to institutionalize that kind of sharing, brings triads of schools together with a facilitator from our office to help people have conversations about what the practices are, to investigate them in the building on the ground, and to go back to the partner schools and to see what implementation looks like with the eye of the principal in the school that have begun the practice, helping guide the implementation. It's the key element of the program, I believe, is buy-in, that people want to do this. People want to share. How do we get principals to get into each other's schools? We ask them, do you want to do this? And do you think you have the ability to grow and learn? Part of, I think, I know what Carmen's talking about when she talks about bringing dignity back to the profession, is talking about making sure we reinvest in ourselves as learners. And we remember that we have access to answers. The tagline for the program, and the lovely tagline for the program, is the answer is in the room. Part of what we have to remember is the room is gigantic. That the room is that classroom where we see something happening well, that school where we see the institutional structures that allow it to happen well, but the entire city where people are supporting and talking about programs that are working. We need to remember that we're learners, that we're going to test what we learn in our own classrooms and adjust it, and ideally it'll be an iterative process, and what happens in one school will return to the school that started it even better. I think what we're going to do is encourage people to talk.
Well, it's just that the consortium has a residency program that operates 2 days a semester, where teachers, schools identify something that they'd like to be happy to have people visit and share. And the teachers at all the consortium schools, there's a whole list published, and teachers indicate which one they want to go to, and then 2 days each semester, they're out visiting each other in the classrooms looking at that. And we have a residency for principals where the principals go to 2 schools, this time it was in the Bronx, and they look at a common question that everybody is interested in, and then they come together to share. So
Great.
I think it's a really...
And Phil, will that learning and those exchanges include charter schools and public schools?
The application, which I think is online now, is available to all New York City schools.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte, Frank.
I want to thank the panel and the presentations today. And the words are, it's not in one place, not in one teacher, it's not in one school. And since I'm here at NYU, and the question has to do with the larger community, schools of education, who are preparing new teachers and preparing principals, administrators, and how would what you are doing at the DOE, because I've also been at the same meetings with Carmen, and listened to what Phil, you have really described it beautifully. It really sends the message out. It's the words you had of learning partners and all of that. We are all partners in this. My question is, how should schools of education be designed? Are they designed the way they should be? What kinds of changes do you think should happen, or what should happen in the schools of education to better prepare teachers and administrators? Because what's happening in these buildings and in buildings across this city, this is the clue to how to grow and achieve the goals that all of us have in this room.
Let me, Frank, do you want to take that one since you're at a school of education?
Oh, yeah. I think schools of education need to do several things in preparing both teachers and principals. I think first and foremost, they need to actually convince, by teaching, but also modeling how you use data. In fact, universities, including schools of education, don't often have the best teachers. So because...
Are you serious?
University,
shocking.
University faculty are often not taught to teach. But so the idea of how to use data, how to use feedback. So university faculty are often very reluctant to accept the ratings that their students give them and the comments that their students give them about things that could change. They need to model differently. They need to show it, but they need to teach the teachers. Use data, be open to feedback, and the idea of continual learning, this idea of revision that Anne talks about, is not just appropriate for students. It's appropriate for all professionals, including teachers and principals. And the other thing is that I think we need to communicate to teachers and principals the key importance of the teacher in the classroom, because when I actually speak to student teachers and I ask them who's responsible for student learning, sometimes the teacher is 7, 8, 10 on the list. The student, the parent, the community, and stuff, that the teacher needs to own the fact that, in fact, they're responsible, first and foremost, for student learning. And schools of education need to teach them that.
All right, we'll turn to Peter Goodman, a well-known New York City blogger on education.
Thank you. Instead of assessing schools by grades A through F, if we went back and looked at students' addresses, for example, kids living in the Marcus Garvey houses in Brownsville, or kids living in the pink houses in East New York, as far back as we could possibly go, we would find dropouts and crime rates and kids being suspended and everything else going on and on for decades and decades. And schools have made very little impact on kids living in the deepest of poverty. How do schools deal with the truly disadvantaged when for decades they've shown very little progress in dealing with these kids? Can schools make the difference, or do we have to go beyond schools and look at an approach which is more community-based than simply school-based?
Thanks.
I mean, of course, schools can make some of the difference. The issue of poverty is a citywide and a national issue, and we can't pretend that we can fix that issue in our schools, but we will all together have a tremendous effect on young people if we are working in a way that makes us able to better help move them along a continuum of skills that will allow them to enter the world with choices of their own, the ability to represent their own good thinking in an interview, tie ideas together that are their own. We have a tremendous part of the responsibility in our schools, but I do think, yes, we share that responsibility with the neighbors of every. We have to own every student in the city together.
But I want to add, though, to Peter's question, because there's a kind of assumption of equity built into the way we do this. Kids at 321 are taking the same test as the kids in Brownsville, even though we know that the kids at PS 321 are getting a whole lot more support from their families. Their families are investing in them, and that's not really accounted for when we think about preparation and what these scores mean, right? That is, I know at some of our elite schools, parents are paying for private tutors. They're investing large private resources in their children that poor parents don't have. How do we account for those disparities in inputs? Frank, do you want to?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, children of poverty can learn. So the idea that because they come from poor families means that they can't learn, I think, is something we need to get rid of. Two, the point I think is well taken. Schools can't do it alone. We need to work with communities and families, but ultimately, the school becomes the center because the school is providing the kid with the skills. And in fact, what research shows very clearly is that when, in point of fact, you're in a challenging environment, the school becomes much more important than, for each student learning to read than the kid whose family can afford private tutors and so forth. And we've got to remember that, in fact, despite the disparities in inputs, being able to read your grade 4 text doesn't differ, right? So you can't say that we need to change the standards for kids, because what happens is if you do that, in fact, you end up in some sense institutionalizing the achievement gap, right?
You know, I think we have to rethink what we're doing in the schools, and particularly for kids who don't have certain advantages at home. One of the fallouts, one of the consequences, unintended perhaps, of high-stakes testing is that and putting schools on notice that that data counts for a whole lot, is that when we look at the schools in the high-poverty areas, those were the very schools that ended up having more test prep, more time, more money devoted to prepping kids for the tests, and less time spent on art, on music, on the performing arts, on taking kids on field trips. I would be perfectly happy having schools have the same kind of curriculum that Malia and Sasha have, but in every school. I don't understand why we're in a situation where, in order to make up what the schools have taken out, or what principals have, because they're under pressure, taken out, in the middle class schools, we know that schools are raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they're buying services from art teachers, they're bringing in performing artists, they're providing those kids in those schools with all kinds of activities, which unfortunately have come to be called enrichment. I don't see them as enrichment. I see them as the basic part of every child's education, and every child should be entitled to those kinds of activities and those kinds of offerings. And I think if we would share, I'm very worried about the pre-K programs that are coming in. I think it's a great idea. But I think that we're in danger of having those programs turn into prep classes for first grade. I hope that all of you who feel that way will communicate those worries, because I'm getting reports from kindergarten teachers that I work with who are telling me that the kids who are coming in from the pre-K programs that exist now have fewer social skills. They can't handle group work. Because they've done so much seat time, because teachers are trying to get them ready. Ready for what? So I would say if we can't walk into every one of these pre-K classes and see sand and water and dress-up areas and cooking and all kinds of activities that middle class and upper class children have as part of their entitlement, I think we will find that over time those pre-K programs will not give us the kind of enriched and ready for school experiences that these kids so badly need.
Okay, thank you, Ann. We have a hard stop at 10:30, so I'm going to just ask for the questions to be brief and the responses to be brief over here.
Sharing academic best practices is not a new concept. As a matter of fact, this was the driving force behind the New Vision schools that morphed into the charter schools. Why are we still presenting this kind of idea and concept as though it was new, without identifying the results or the positive results of the best practices being shared in the past that benefited the students and the teachers? We're still talking about the sharing, we're still talking about giving different titles to people coming together, or the academics coming together, without any stated results.
I think we are just trying to promote what we think works well. We have, as a principal who worked with New Visions for many years, I think I benefited tremendously from the knowledge of my colleagues. And I'm not sure we're claiming this as something new or different. We're claiming this as a strategy that we think will be effective, and we want to make sure that we promote it as best we can.
Okay, thank you. We'll go here and then here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Julie Slatson. I work for the Young Women's Leadership Network. And I was hearing lots of really interesting things, but two of the things that really stuck with me, and I feel like was expressed by all of the panelists in some form, were the idea that assessment isn't inherently bad, and it can be used to really figure out how we can move students along purposefully to, achieve what they need to in order to go to college. But also that we live in New York City, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And it's about conversations about what resources different schools or different neighborhoods, populations of students need in order to move along. I guess within that conversation, my question is within that conversation about what different schools and different groups of students need and what resources you need to apply to those groups in order to move them along, who, from your differing perspectives, should be absorbing the cost of those resources and that time? And the reason I ask is because I work for an organization that does seek to provide some of those extra resources and spend the time to think about how we can best improve our students' academic experience and their achievement. So, but we're a private organization. And is that the future? Is that what we should be looking to for schools like you mentioned, Ms. Cook, where they raise a ton of money in order to support their students' academic growth? Or should there be some other entity that's...
Briefly, I think government should be doing this, state, federal. We spend a lot of money incarcerating youth, probably much more than we should, and much less money in education. And at the end of the day, to the extent that the US wants to continue to claim its role of leader in the world, if we do not invest in educating our youth, we are not going to be able to claim that, and in fact, because in fact we will not have the society that we have today.
Okay, I'm Miriam Eisenstein-Ebsworth. I'm a professor here at NYU and a former New York City school teacher from Brooklyn, East New York to be specific. Two questions. One, I want to repeat Pedro's question that nobody answered, which is under the current regime, there is a real disincentive for experienced and excellent teachers who have many choices of schools they can go to stay in the most difficult schools where they will be sanctioned because their children do not make enough progress based on tests not normed on those populations, even if they give them wonderful experiences that encourage them to show up to school and become engaged in school. And it will... education takes time, and it's a nonlinear process. And my question is related to some of the previous ones, which is that under the real world, in the real world we live in, where there are scarce economic and human resources, and where the school is the most important place for children at risk, why aren't we spending more of those resources on tutoring, after-school programs, summer programs, community engagement, parent education? You mentioned the social and emotional component. I don't see those in either the standards or the tests.
Okay. Should we just get more questions, or do you want anybody to respond? All right, let's keep taking them. But I think, because as Miriam pointed out, I did ask that question, right? So let's.
Hi, I'm Megan Moskop, and I'm a special education teacher in Washington Heights. And I heard a lot on the panel about teachers needing to know how to use data. I'd argue that a lot of teachers know how to use data, and the problem is that we don't get useful data from standardized tests. We get useful data from our own classroom tests, and we communicate that with students and talk about mastery. In the instruction book for the test that I administered, which I think I'm allowed to talk about, it said for me to tell my students that the purpose of this test, that they shouldn't be stressed, because the purpose of this test was to find out which standards have been mastered and which need further development. I can't honestly say that in good faith to my students now, because as a teacher, I never get that information. All I get is a number. And it hurts to tell a student, you're a 1.98. Let's do better next time. You failed, but you didn't get to go to summer school because there wasn't funding. So what I want to know is, I guess, do you think that there's a way that we can have common systems that give useful data to students so that they can be empowered to improve? I know rubrics do that. I know performance assessments do that. But is that something we can get from standardized tests? And if we can get that, how?
Yeah, very good question. And if I could add on to it, because the Department of Education recently said it's going to rethink the way it's rating schools and the way it's using this information to make judgments, and you got attacked by some of the papers in town who said this is a return to social promotion. And what I thought was ironic, it was like they didn't realize that there were thousands of kids coming to New York City high schools each year who are still reading third grade level, right? That social promotion never ended, right? So, but I think the question is about the usefulness of this data and what will replace. If we're going to try to do something different, and it's going to hopefully be more thoughtful, what does that start to look like?
I mean, I think we're trying. I think there's two answers. There are two things to talk about in that question. One is about what we do in our classrooms, and I think that we have an obligation to begin a larger discussion about how we use information well about our students. I do think that teachers have been assessing kids for as long as there's been school, and some teachers do it much better than others. And I think we need to learn from each other to make sure that we continue to assess well and that we start to share. The thing that changed in the school where I was working was we started to share our assessments more thoughtfully in terms of what information we were gleaning from the assessments, not how our students were performing on the assessments. In some ways it was a hard discussion because it was a discussion about how we were performing on our students' assessments. I don't know whether as we look at statewide assessments that we're going to change the nature of those assessments for our students and for ourselves immediately, but I think that a conversation like this is the beginning of that change, and I think it's an important conversation and an important movement to start to see assessments, all of the assessments, including statewide assessments, as opportunities to learn. I think that in New York City we have begun to look at the ways in which we create an accountability system that we hope will move us more toward being thoughtful about the work that's happening in our schools, an accountability system that will cause us to ask questions rather than to create summative answers about what's happening in our schools, and an accountability system that we will train ourselves to be able to say, I wonder why this is working here relative to why it's not working there, and can we use this information to engender a conversation about what the differences are?
Okay. Frank, your response?
The simple answer to this idea, a grade equivalence score tells a teacher absolutely nothing, because a 1.9 or 2.7 or whatever is a combination of scores, and it means very different things for different kids. So it's a useless piece of information, and in fact, we tell our students not to use it. I'm a trained school psychologist. If we want those kinds of tests to be useful from a diagnostic point of view, we need to give reports that are by standards, what standards are met versus not met, and we actually need to do it such that teachers can use it. And so it may well be that we need to move it earlier in the year so that teachers get it, so they can use it in the same grade level, or use it as information for the teacher in the next grade level. Because when you're giving tests to hundreds of thousands of kids, they have to be scored. It's not possible to score them and turn them around typically in a week or two. So that, in fact, we need to change the whole system for those standardized tests to be useful.
Okay, so we only have about 3 minutes left. What I'm going to do is just ask for very brief comments, questions from as many of the people we can take in the time remaining.
I'm a graduate student here at Steinhardt. My name is Anna Hillary, and I'm a former teacher at Facing History School, which is, of course, Consortium school. And so I'm very familiar with the way in which performance assessment is empowering for students, and also informative for teachers because of the long process of revision and ongoing data that teachers use. The rigor associated with it, in which students are asked to essentially perform a high school level oral dissertation defense at the end of the year, was incredibly useful for both students and teachers. And I'm wondering if you could, any of you, speak about the conversation that's taking place between educators, education leaders, and policymakers in terms of perhaps spreading these kinds of performance assessments. Perhaps they're not the answer, but I would suggest that perhaps they're more useful than for 39 schools out of 1,800. And what kind of conversation is taking place, and if it's not currently effective, what kind of strategies could be used to further this conversation?
I think didn't we address that already when we said...
You want to keep going? Or?
Yeah, let's keep going, because I think we basically said the commissioner heard it and didn't do anything. So that's where it stopped, unfortunately, right now. Yes.
All right, hello. My name is Leeton Hall. I'm a science teacher in the South Bronx. And we already know the issue is the Black and Latino students when it comes to their learning. What more is the administration going to do? What more as teachers can we do to help our students who are already at a disadvantage?
Okay. Let's get a next one.
Hi, my name is Amy Shire. I am a parent of a 5th grader at PS8 in Brooklyn and also a member of my district's Community Education Council. And I have a comment which is basically a reaction to Pedro Noguera's sort of paraphrasing of other people's comments about the opt-out and the critique of the tests being sort of focused on white middle class, stemming from white middle class population. I just want to say briefly that we had a meeting a few weeks ago in my district, which is a very diverse one, a very segregated one, I might add, but a diverse one. I think it's important to make that distinction. It included somebody from the DOE coming to talk about the tests and also some critiques, which included exploring opting out. And the participants were quite diverse and quite interested in the dialogue. And among the many comments I heard afterwards were, wow, never heard anything about this before. So this is really actually just a plea for not just testing issues, but any kind of policy issues. Please bring them out to the districts, come and talk to us, and you will find a very diverse group of parents who are very interested in engaging in discussion.
Yeah, I would also add that I was in Chicago when the opt-out was taking place, and it was happening in the South Side in very diverse communities. So,
also
over
in
here,
Castle Bridge, by the way,
okay.
Washington Heights, which is anyway.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vivette Hemans. I'm a teacher, high school English teacher at the Eagle Academy for Young Men of Southeast Queens, as well as a member of Educators for Excellence. And my question is, I'm very engaged in this conversation we're having here, but what happens after 10:30 when we all leave? How can we take this conversation back to our schools? How can we kind of spread this fire that's been lit this morning?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, it's the last question. I've been told by our dean, cut it. Time to go. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, colleagues, that we won't get to take any more, much less even answer, but I think it's a good question to think about. How do we make sure that these conversations don't end here, that we are, in fact, really thinking deeply about how to use what we know works, how do we use assessment as a tool, how do we create schools like those potatoes in Phil's garden that are flourishing all over the city. So I want to thank all of you. I'm sorry that we won't be able to take any more, but thank you for coming out. The pancake